Well, if you're too young to remember the original, many think we might be living now through the early days of a new Cold War, and others say it's worse than that, potentially. Nile Gardiner is with the Heritage Foundation, and he joins me from Washington. So is this a new Cold War?
Well, I think certainly we're in a huge fight against a very dangerous adversary. I think it's open to interpretation whether we're engaged in another Cold War, but in some respects, I think the enemy that we face today in the form of Vladimir Putin and his regime is in some aspects more dangerous than the old communist regime. I do think that Vladimir Putin is an extremely dangerous adversary for the United States, for Great Britain, and for their allies across the world. So yes, we are engaged in another global conflict against a regime that is absolutely brutal, that is capable of using chemical weapons on European soil, that has no respect whatsoever for human rights or for human life. And so we must be on our guard and be vigilant.
But you won't go as far as to use that term.
I think it's different in some respects because we're not necessarily faced with something on the scale of the old Soviet Union, an ideological adversary. We're dealing with something more akin perhaps to, late 19th century imperial Russia. And I think that Vladimir Putin is a sort of traditional Russian imperialist. And I think he is someone who is willing to project and use deadly force against his enemies. But I would say we are engaged once again in a global conflict against an enemy that certainly is happy to use lethal force and certainly would like to see the demise of the Western world.
Yeah, and they have, if you believe those who have studied the digital meddling and on Facebook, the spread of fake news, the attempt to influence the U.S. election, even some say the Brexit referendum, the Catalan referendum, they have used non-military force to have a big impact for very little initial investment, if you think about it. Do you think this Western response is enough to change the behavior of the country, of Vladimir Putin?
I think we have to approach the Russian threat in many different ways. Of course, we have to counter the cyber threat posed by Moscow. Also, of course, Russia's desire to intervene in Western elections. But at the same time, we must build up military might in Eastern Europe, especially in the Baltic states, as a message to Putin that if he does make a move for one of the Baltics, he will be met with the entire military response of the whole NATO alliance. And we must also, of course, stand with those in Russia who are fighting against the Russian dictatorship. We must stand up for those dissidents who put their lives on the line every day. This is exactly what Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan did during the Cold War. And we must back those allies in what Russia calls its near abroad, who are in the direct line of fire of Putin's Russia, of course, including Ukraine. And we have seen now the United States arming the Ukrainian government in the face of that threat.
You were an aide to Margaret Thatcher. If you were advising Theresa May over this, what would your recommendation be?
I think, firstly, certainly Theresa May's leadership so far has been very strong on this Russia question. And the British government has certainly implemented some very robust measures, but more needs to be done. I think we need to see a significant increase in British defence spending. It should be increased to at least 3% of GDP, more British forces deployed in Eastern Europe, particularly to the Baltic states. We've also got to act against the Russian oligarchs, several hundred of whom have investments in the United Kingdom. We need to act against their assets. We need to certainly hurt Putin economically. And we
but this
must
is
do
what's
more.
not being done, Nile Gardiner. This is really where we're not seeing very robust measures being taken, right?
I think
because
British,
I mean, if you have all this Russian money and London property and elsewhere, and oligarchs as well. I mean, spending money in this economy, and not just in London and other parts of the Western world. So if you really wanted to take action, that you could, but it's not being done.
I think it's being contemplated, and I think the British government is actively discussing these measures. There are also discussions here in Washington with regard to potentially the freezing of assets of Russian oligarchs, visa bans, etc. So these measures are all being discussed. They do need to be implemented. We also must see as well the leader of the free world, President Trump, directly confronting Vladimir Putin on a personal level. We need to see that kind of leadership. The approach of the Trump administration so far in terms of policies has been very strong. We do need to see the US president himself aggressively confronting Vladimir Putin, calling him to account, just as Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan held Soviet leaders to account.
Well, we haven't seen that yet. Nile Gardiner, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
This evening.